You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 353, recorded on Tuesday, February 23rd, 2021. This is your bonus episode for the week. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line, as always, from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
And joining us, special first-time guest appearance on the show, is my friend, Ben, a.k.a. housetrotter. Hi, Ben. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be here. Hey, Bill. Hey, Rachel.
So, Ben, we have you on this week to talk about the American Protective League with us. On past episodes, we've talked about Chicago business tycoons sponsoring and supplying police, as well as funding labor infiltration by private agencies. On this week's bonus episode, however, we're talking about the Chicago business community's perhaps darkest formation, the American Protective League, an extra-legal volunteer private force of hundreds of thousands of narcs and snitches during World War I, funded by private capital. And the big twist, compared to the Pinkertons of the previous era, which we've done episodes on before, was that the League's unpaid membership wasn't a bunch of lowlifes in search of paid work, but instead was entirely unpaid and primarily white-collar workers and executives and small businessmen, and it was directly affiliated to the U.S. Department of Justice under Attorney General Thomas Watt Gregory and working in conjunction with the Bureau of Investigation, which at the time was relatively new and still relatively small in number. Ben, before we dive into this, what are some of the sort of big overarching themes that you're going to want us to latch on to as we go through the narrative on this organization?
Yeah, I think this time period in general is very interesting because this is sort of the origin for a lot of the first attempts at American intelligence agencies, both domestic counterintelligence as well as foreign intelligence. So there's definitely a lot of tendencies that you see that are consistent between this group and a lot of the later attempts, particularly after World War II. So, for example, one of the big ones is using national security as a pretext to create a group which can then be used to suppress workers' movements. That's a pretty common theme that you see post-World War II, especially with the FBI's COINTELPRO program. Another big thing is this nexus of sort of private capital and the government, the intelligence services. You see this quite famously in the origins of the CIA. Alan Dulles was a lawyer for investment bankers, and it's a very similar story here. This is an intelligence agency which is founded by Chicago's business elite. So it's a long tradition of these business elites forming these intelligence agencies with a national security pretext that end up being used for their more typical bourgeois interests of suppressing workers' movements. Those are the two things that I see as being kind of the key through lines in American intelligence agencies over the course of the 20th century.
Absolutely agree with you there, and that was why I decided to bring you on the episode today, because as I was doing the readings on this, which were quite extensive, even though it's a bit of an obscure topic, I kept on thinking, this is what Ben would comment about this particular angle. So there's a few web links that will be up at arsenalfordemocracy.com. Actually, I guess in this case will be up at the patreon.com/arsenalfordemocracy in a PDF. But in addition to those web links, most of what we're going to be talking about is drawn from two particular books that I got out of the library. And we can talk about the sort of quality and scope of those books. So those two books, before we get into those, are The League, The True Story of Average Americans on the Hunt for World War I Spies by Bill Mills, 2013, Skyhorse Publishing. And the second book that we'll be talking about a bit later in the episode is The Price of Vigilance by Joan M. Jensen, published in 1968 by Rand McNally and Co. So the 2013 book by Bill Mills, it's a much shorter book, kind of gets you the key facts of the situation, but not necessarily some of the broader implications. There's a lot less kind of analysis of it than in the Jensen book. The Mills book is kind of a hobbyist history. I would say it's not necessarily super rigorous. It's sort of written in a dramatized popular history style, which is not necessarily bad, but it's the kind of thing where they're like, the sun was getting low that day, or, it was a sweltering day in New York, that kind of thing. I think also Mills is probably a little bit too generous in assuming good or pure intentions among the members of the American Protective League, but he does criticize the government's illegal and unconstitutional use of them to conduct warrantless searches, which is a very common function they were used for, as well as crushing anti-war dissent. He does emphasize that the German embassy to the neutral U.S. and the German Navy had spent the first 3 years of the war organizing and funding sabotage campaigns against U.S. military-industrial production and actually bombing U.S. War materiel shipping. But he also notes repeatedly that the German sabotage campaign that was kind of used to justify the APL being formed basically evaporated almost overnight when the U.S. actually entered the war in 1917. So the ostensible reason for forming the APL should have gone away, and instead, unsurprisingly, the organization pivoted pretty quickly.
So Mills also contends that this was merely a patriotic endeavor and that the non-governmental leadership of the APL was uniformly against peacetime domestic volunteer spying and believed most of their members would rapidly lose interest anyway immediately after the armistice.
I think that is basically true. Like, it did kind of, go away pretty quickly after the war. We'll talk a little bit about some of the post-war legacies of it later. But, certainly, like, he views the patriotic endeavor as being kind of a neutral to positive concept, whereas, like, we would probably look at that in a sort of reactionary lens. Let's get into talking about who the APL was, who it was founded by, because this is sort of important to identifying, as Ben said, the character of this organization, not only its composition, but its relationship between the state and capital. So the APL was founded by advertising vice president and future magnate Albert M. Briggs, also known as A.M. Briggs, who was a veteran of the Spanish-American War in Cuba. So he's a middle-aged guy, goes on to become this sort of like advertising tycoon after the war. But he's like a reasonably successful, quite well-connected, schmoozy business guy based in Chicago at the time. So he approached the U.S. DOJ Chicago offices to pitch his idea in February 1917. And it's important to emphasize this idea came from the private sector rather than coming from the government. This was before the U.S. had entered World War I, but after the end of diplomatic relations, after the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany was attempting political and materiel sabotage of private U.S. assistance to the Allied powers already. And the DOJ office in Chicago was surprised by the offer, but realized that this was a potential source not only of extra eyes and manpower, but also off-budget resources for basics like automobiles for special agents. For example, Briggs rapidly organized groups of wealthy businessmen to donate dozens of cars to government offices around the nation. So, Ben, I wanted to pause there and talk about that notion of off-budget resources. This is something that you see as being a sort of key through line with the future development of the intelligence state and the capital state nexus.
Yeah, definitely. This was a common thing, particularly you see this before the institutions are formalized in the state. So, for example, the very early years of the CIA wanted to intervene in Italy, and there was no sort of formal organization to do this with yet. The CIA hadn't really been formed yet, and so they essentially passed around a hat, and various private concerns donated funds for the U.S. government to intervene, sort of off the books in the Italian election. And you also see similar things, for example, in the UK, there was a nexus between sort of former MI6 officers and groups like Aims of Industry, which were industrial groups in the UK in the 70s and 80s, agitating against workers' movements over there. So this technique of sort of when you can't get the budget through the typical means, via Congress or getting funded directly by the government, you can sort of pass around this hat. I do think what is interesting and unique here is that the idea did not come from within the government. And sort of the idea came externally, which I think is quite unique and not something that you see in a later period when it is a bit more institutionalized.
I think it definitely speaks to the fact that the U.S. government was a much smaller entity overall in the run-up to World War I than it was after World War I, and then certainly after World War II, and the New Deal state and so forth hadn't emerged yet as well. Just having that shortages. I mean, again, we're going to be talking about an organization that ultimately has hundreds of thousands of volunteer members compared to each office of the DOJ or the Bureau of Investigation entering the war with basically, oh, here's a dozen agents to cover the entire Great Lakes region or whatever. Again, just giving you a sense of the scale disparity here that Briggs was attempting to address with his proposal. In addition to his sort of organizing of initially, kind of a volunteer motor pool type of thing, or donated motor pool, what do you think about the fact that Briggs then traveled to D.C. to argue that advertising market research techniques could be used for intelligence gathering?
This is so interesting to me because this was roughly the time that Bernays was also sort of formulating his ideas about how to do this kind of thing, how to use propaganda, how to use these marketing techniques. The techniques of marketing really arise with, you all have been talking on this program about the second industrial revolution and the consolidation and monopolization. And that's the period in which marketing comes to the fore and becomes a real technique in business. And I think it's unsurprising that it sort of merges into the way that the state was behaving at this time. The idea that you would, because for a business, understanding your market is key if you want to sell your products, right? Particularly in conditions of stagnation and monopolization that existed really post 1870. So I think the idea sort of comes naturally to a business person, right? You need to understand what is going on amongst the so-called market of opinion, of political belief amongst the American populace during this time when you're about to go to war. So it's very interesting. And like I say, I see shades of Bernays here, who obviously wrote literally the book on propaganda in the mid-20s. And he was also getting his start around this time, sort of formalizing these ideas about how to use business marketing and advertising techniques for the purposes of state.
One thing that comes up in the other book actually is this notion that because this was this private entity that was so closely aligned with business, some of their intelligence gathering was not actually particularly useful intelligence for the government to genuinely understand what was happening on the ground, because if the people who were collecting it or filtering the intelligence didn't think it was important for the government to understand why, some riot had broken out or something, they just wouldn't pass that up the chain. And I think that shows sort of the limitations of this strategy. He can suggest to the government, oh, we'll be able to do market research in the population and tell you what they're thinking. But if they don't actually pass that along because, well, surely that's not important to the war effort, because they have, as she put it in her book, not always aligned interests between the business owners and the government during this period. There was obviously a lot of alignment, but it wasn't always 100% aligned. So I thought that was an interesting point as well. So just before the war was officially declared by the U.S. in April, Briggs was given full approval to begin his project of, quote, confidentially organizing divisions all over the country, especially in communities with large German immigrant populations. As we'll see, this ended up being heavily targeted at sort of domestic political dissent and leftists and so forth. But initially, the genesis of it was primarily to be directed at German immigrants and German sympathizers and people who, the term used throughout these books is pro-Germans. That was apparently a very common phrase at the time. And Briggs began circulating letters, placing long-distance phone calls, traveling in person to recruit men of similar social and economic positions to his own position to basically set up local divisions that would work with the DOJ as part of this project. Rachel, this project that Briggs launches takes off extremely fast, and I know you wanted to talk about kind of how fast it grew and the sort of unique structure compared to, say, like the Pinkertons or something like that we've talked about previously.
Yeah. So within 2 months of launching the project, Briggs had established 400 local divisions with 80,000 members, and just a few months later, there were 900 divisions with 112,000 members. It was generally appealing to men who were either too old to serve or draft exempt under family breadwinner provisions. Recruitment was sort of a pyramid scheme where senior men recruited more junior men they knew, who in turn recruited more men, which is what allowed it to grow so quickly. There were almost no quote-unquote walk-in members who weren't recruited by someone higher up. 80% of prospective candidates were rejected for recruitment after being vetted or interviewed, sometimes just because they couldn't commit to the unpaid time required. Very few women were admitted despite their clear potential as spies and investigators because they would probably need to be recruited on the basis of being the wife of an existing member, and this could create drama, especially if other wives were rejected. And this is in direct contrast to the Pinkertons, who really recruited heavily against kind of young men, kind of disaffected men. And also, they kind of had a point of pride of recruiting women as well, because they saw their potential as those spies and investigators. And they kind of used that like in an ID poll sort of way as like a feather in their cap, like, oh, look at us, we have women involved in the Pinkertons as well. So that is a pretty clear distinction between these two organizations.
Yeah, and I think we'll circle back in a few minutes to talk about that, kind of the class composition of this organization, which will become very apparent over the course of this narrative. So Briggs also recruited Captain T.B. Crockett, who, as an Army lieutenant, had done field work in counterinsurgency espionage in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. Crockett, who was, I guess, related to Davy Crockett, by the way, helped determine a paramilitary platoon and commander structure for the APL organization. A number of other retired military intelligence specialists also held key roles. The Mills book never really circles back to the implications of that point. The other book by Jensen seems to suggest that a lot of the military intelligence guys, either active duty or retired, who were linked to the APL, were specifically veterans of the counterinsurgency in the Philippines, and that they pushed to be able to use the APL civilian investigators as plainclothes helpers to the always uniformed military intelligence personnel, but eventually the military would opt somewhat informally to recruit their own civilians because they didn't necessarily want to deal with some of the amateurism of the APL. So Ben, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about this angle, the connection between, I mean, you know, most of these guys who were on the older end of this project, like Briggs, as well as Crockett, had been involved in the Spanish-American War, but in this case, the military intelligence guys all coming from the post-Spanish-American War counterinsurgency in the Philippines, which was quite brutal.
Yeah, I think this is extremely interesting in the context of a lot of the programs that existed in the United States, particularly post-Vietnam War, but also earlier than that, but especially post-Vietnam War, where you see counterinsurgency tactics that were used in Vietnam, things like the Phoenix program, which was a CIA counterinsurgency, pretty brutal counterinsurgency program in Vietnam. Those tactics come home. And, you know, before becoming aware of the APL, I didn't realize how far back that goes, but it makes a lot of sense. You know, it is pretty typical for the tactics which are used as part of the Imperial Project abroad, which is also obviously deeply connected and implicated with the economy at home. But to see those actual tactics for how do you manage that Imperial Project, how do you deal with dissent, you know, people who are not happy with your colonies, there's a lot of domestic dissent as well. So it makes sense that those same tactics come home and get used. And in, you know, in the case of the Phoenix program, it was a lot of the former soldiers and CIA officers who had worked in that program later trained and briefed police leaders in the United States to deal with things like the Black Panthers. And so I think it's unsurprising, particularly when we'll talk later about the role that this group played in suppressing, you know, the Wobblies and the socialists, to see that same thing gets brought back. And also, I mean, that kind of thing still exists today. I don't think the Chicago Police Department black sites exist without American counterinsurgency tactics in Iraq. So it's an ongoing phenomenon.
Rachel, I know you wanted to talk more about kind of the class composition elements that you were just alluding to, because while it's obviously interesting and important to look at guys like Crockett from the counterinsurgency side, that was really not typical of, you know, the type of people that were being recruited into this organization. And I think that's it's a good point for us to talk about that and talk about some of the other important figures in the organization.
Yeah, another key figure in the APL was Briggs's friend, Charles Frey, who was a fellow Chicago advertising executive. And the two of them, plus Frey's attorney, Victor Elting, would serve as basically the three full-time unpaid staffers of the APL. So they were independently wealthy. They could afford to spend time on this project. Frey drafted guidelines for how local divisions should organize themselves after formation. Much of the plan focused on slotting the white-collar volunteers into investigative assignments related to their own occupations, such as real estate, finance, insurance, engineering, accounting, medical records, hotels, restaurants, entertainment, transportation, public utilities, general merchandise, and so on. This is at least true on paper, but obviously more chaotic in practice, especially due to the secrecy around the structures and membership, attempting to keep members from knowing too many other members beyond their cell of activity. There were also volunteers assigned to various support functions like legal and administrative advice or motor services. The organization's books would be externally audited by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Frey was also made a captain in the U.S. Army so he could serve as APL liaison to military intelligence at the War Department. Frey's brother was killed in action in Europe near the end of the war.
And I think that's an important point as well, which goes back to something that you said earlier, Rachel, about the draft exemptions. If we look at the composition of who this was, it was typically guys who were either, just a little bit too old, or maybe a decade or so too old to be drafted, or they were exempt for some reason, usually that they were married with children and there was no other source of income to support the family, but they wanted to get involved in the war. And while their, siblings and cousins and friends went off and died in the trenches, they were here, essentially playing, a glorified cops and robbers game back home. That's something I think that Mills doesn't really emphasize enough, because he doesn't really want to indict the sincerity of a lot of these guys, but I think that's something worth emphasizing. I did think it was pretty funny how many ad guys were involved in this, and we're not even to the end of the involvement of the ad men in this, but that seemed to be a specific thing. But as you can see, they were drawing from a wide range of professions, but again, overwhelmingly these white-collar professions. We'll talk in a bit about some of their blue-collar membership, but mostly it was these white-collar members, and a lot of their jobs, sure, it might be, tailing someone, through the night streets or whatever. That was certainly a thing that they did. But in a lot of cases, a lot of their investigations, quote unquote, was basically doing all this sort of paperwork snooping, right? Getting access to records that normally wouldn't be accessible to law enforcement by just having a guy in every single office in America that had access to these kind of records so that they could look it up on their own without anyone really signing off on it or authorizing it.
I do think that in general with intelligence agencies, there's this alternating privatization and then incorporation of the public state, and there are benefits and downsides to both. So, one of the things that occurred with the APL is that they essentially destroyed all their documents. And when you're a private organization, you don't have accountability in that respect. You're not regulated by the public state, and so you can do things like, as you mentioned, get access to documents that normally wouldn't be available to the government. But there are also big downsides to that, and it's just interesting that this group sort of rides the line between the two and seems to try to have it both ways, essentially, not have accountability to the public state, and on the other hand, take advantage of all of the things that you can do when you're a private individual and you're not, bound by all those pesky constitutional laws and rights that the citizens have.
Absolutely. And now, we've so far been talking about these kind of middle management, vice presidents and junior vice president type people at various companies, large and small. Let's talk about the big capital, though, behind this. This was the paragraph of my notes where I'm reading through this page and I go, all right, we got to get Ben on this episode. Going to the Chicago APL, which was kind of considered the unofficial national HQ branch until the leadership relocated to Washington, D.C., and this was probably the biggest division throughout the entire war. They had these so-called intelligence division chiefs, which, as far as I can tell, were probably kind of more ceremonial roles, but basically authorizing pretty significant penetration into the private sector of this intelligence gathering networks. And this is where you get the guys who are at the top of the food chain in American capitalism, or at least in Chicago capitalism. We have the president of the First National Bank, the president of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, the president of the Chicago Telephone Company, the president of Montgomery Ward, and so forth. So, Ben, I got to get your reaction on that. I mean, talk about an organization we haven't heard of, and then you see these guys are involved with it.
Yeah, this to me was so interesting when you because again I was not familiar with this group until you brought it up to me not too long ago. This from a very early point, this nexus between big capital and intelligence activities, and this is an ongoing thing. As I mentioned, like Alan Dulles, for example, was a lawyer for many of the financiers, and I sort of think of because this becomes the model for how governance is done, right? This is a secret organization. It's doing activities of the state, but it's not accountable to the public. It is in kind of the truest sense a deep state. And I sort of think of that as the model of governance going forward. And this was like a first stab at it. I think it is in the same way that sort of liberal democracy is the political form of the economic system of Marxist time, sort of the so-called competitive capitalist era. This kind of deep state is the political form of this monopoly capitalist era, where you have these. There was a time when there were thousands of individual capitalists, right? There was a shoe factory in every New England town, but you get to this point in time and it's all consolidated. There's very few people, so just a few people in a room can make decisions of state that affect their entire class, and it's you see a reorganization of how the state works. This kind of thing would not have been possible in an earlier period where there were not presidents of the First National Bank, which controlled, the financial capital of a great proportion of the ownership class of this country, right? So this is like this is like this first attempt or this sort of nascent rise of this new type of political organization, which obviously, as you mentioned, because of the expansion of the state during the FDR years, and particularly post-World War II, the expansion of the military, the expansion of the intelligence apparatus, it really takes its full form, I think, in that period. But it is so interesting to me to see its sort of origins or its first stab at during this time period.
Yeah, absolutely. And this would have been, again, for context, only 10 years after I believe it was 1907 bailout that JP Morgan personally organized to save the U.S. economy, where, he got in a room and forced them to all come to a agreement on, not letting the market tank completely. And that, of course, leads to the creation of the Federal Reserve and so forth. Another thing which we will circle back to is, again, I don't think that these guys who were running these corporate entities, and were presidents of these, I don't think they were like necessarily engaged in day-to-day operations of the APL, but as far as I can tell, their main function was to basically sign off on having tons of APL members working inside their companies, doing all kinds of, off books stuff. As you can guess, First National Bank, you get access to banking records. The railway, you get access to people's, movements. The telephone company, we'll talk about that. They were monitoring people's telephone calls. President of Montgomery Ward, I'm sure you're getting, people's data on their retail purchases and wholesale purchases and things like that. We'll get back to that as well. So when the group needed to raise the money to relocate their headquarters to D.C., which I just alluded to, the Chicago division convened a secret meeting of nearly 7,000 Chicago businessmen who were APL members at a Masonic Temple convention hall, and they raised $82,000 on the spot. I think mostly in cash, basically just like, here, pitch in what you can. That also was kind of crazy to me and felt like that sort of the linkage, which I guess exists later on as well. I'm not as well versed in it as, say, you are, but this sort of nexus between kind of, we're all part of this like secret society, fraternal club thing. Oh, and also we're doing deep state spying activities.
Yep. Yeah, the Masons make a lot of appearances, but I don't think it's anything particular to the Masons. I mean, any organization of elite business people is going to be a place where business is discussed.
Right.
And when you move into intelligence activities, I think it's logical that becomes a place where these sorts of things are organized. There certainly in this period, especially, there are smoky rooms where these kinds of things get organized. And the fact that $82,000 at this time is a pretty astronomical sum of money. And it probably was basically pocket change that people were walking around with.
Right.
So the fact that they were able to raise that in such a short time period is pretty astonishing, but I guess not surprising.
And I should emphasize here, I'm bringing up the Masonic Temple thing because it's kind of interesting. I'm not suggesting that this was some sort of like Masonic conspiracy or whatever. I think it was that they were like, all right, where can we, throw together an event with 7,000 guys? Oh, well, there's 4,000 seats at the, this convention hall, et cetera. Like, it's relying on those existing networks and fraternal and social clubs. One thing that the book talks about is how many different country clubs Briggs had memberships in, not only in Chicago, but in various other, states and so forth. Like, this is the network that they're tapping into. It's nefarious on its face rather than nefarious in the sense of some sort of like Illuminati whatever thing.
Totally.
Yeah.
One thing I'll just mention is like it was pretty common at this time. Like Wilson very frequently, for example, would have meetings at country clubs with with members of the government, but who were also members of the country club with him. So it's a pretty common place for people to do business, in this kind of setting. It's not at all unusual.
Right. One of the guys who set up the military intelligence operations in the War Department during World War I had been explicitly ordered by his chain of command not to talk to the war secretary about setting it up. And according to the Jensen book, his strategy instead was to go talk to a reporter that he knew was going to be having a meeting with the war secretary and basically pitch her for several hours on what a dangerous domestic threat there was and that they needed to have this military intelligence network, and then to go talk to the chief of police in D.C. By the way, one thing that I didn't really talk about in the notes was how involved a lot of chiefs of police were in this particular organization, but that's not really a huge shock, I think. But anyway, the D.C. chief of police, again, getting to that point about these existing sort of social club networks, had breakfast every morning with the war secretary. So he pitches these two people on the need for this organization, and then that's how he gets around his chain of command to get the authorization for this military intelligence to be set up. Rachel, getting back again to the composition of the group, let's talk now about kind of the blue-collar angle of this, because there was some of it, but of course, that comes with a pretty significant catch.
As a point of contrast to the elites involved in the Chicago local division, the Detroit division included both manufacturing executives and the factory floor workers in order to protect plant operations from sabotage, since so much war production was in Detroit. Unsurprisingly, Henry Ford and his company were enthusiastic about the APL. So this book, unlike the other book, doesn't comment on the obvious usage of the APL within Midwestern factories to detect and disrupt unionization drives. It seems likely that lower-level workers and blue-collar members were typically backed by their employers in APL participation. One reason membership would skew toward white-collar employees, especially executives, was because they had more flexibility than wage workers to set their own hours of availability for APL missions.
And that, I think, kind of gets to some of the points that you were alluding to earlier, Ben, which is you have these absolute tycoons of industry like Henry Ford enthusiastically signing off on this and immediately grasping the potential for saying, okay, we're going to disrupt this strike by arresting this guy for distributing unionization literature or whatever, and saying, oh, he was actually, distributing literature against the draft, which is illegal and so forth. One thing the Jensen book talks a lot about was that at the beginning of the war, the U.S. industrialists were repeatedly trying to get the U.S. Army or National Guard, which was deployed all over the country at the time, including sometimes to protect these factories from sabotage. They kept trying to say, oh, this is a national security matter. You need to intervene in the factory. And the military commanders kept on saying, absolutely not. This is not our role. We're not getting involved in industrial disputes. Along comes this APL organization, which is in this more gray area and kind of working with the government, but not necessarily accountable to the government. And so they can basically infiltrate, all levels of a factory or supply chain or whatever, find out who's doing the, unionization, that kind of thing, and really root that out. One anecdote that kind of demonstrates the APL's methods, a traveling salesman overheard two children talking, one of whom mentioned a German spy living in his apartment. By the way, don't tell your kids there's a German spy living in your apartment. They're not going to keep their mouths shut. Anyway, so he reported this to the DOJ, which assigned Chicago APL agents to canvass the building under the pretext of updating the city directory. A cooperative landlady identified a German tenant and provided access to the apartment while no one was home. The APL agents searched a steamer steamer trunk and found a German pistol, ammunition, and engineering drawings of the Chicago Municipal Pier and a federal building. The APL then put everything back, allegedly as they had found it, and got more information about his occupation, which was a draftsman at the federal building, from the landlady. The next day, before sunrise, U.S. Bureau of Investigation agents arrested the tenant, identified him as an employee of the German government, and sent him to Fort Leavenworth. Now, one thing that I want to emphasize here, the Mills book, while kind of giving a lot of anecdotes about things that didn't really pan out to being German sabotage or spying or whatever, tends to treat anecdotes like this at face value, right? There's no presumption or suspicion in this book that some of this evidence might have been planted, right? They're doing warrantless searches of all these people's things and saying, oh, we found this evidence, and then we put it back exactly as we found it, and then we called in the cops and they made the arrest, or, whatever. I think it's worth at least considering the possibility that in many cases, or at least some cases, they were probably planting evidence on people to sort of justify their own existence. Again, that's just sort of my speculation on that.
Another anecdote involves a 16-year-old shop clerk in New York realizing that a German customer was attempting to bribe him for a cash-only purchase of an unusual wireless transmitter part and calling it into a secret APL hotline, which had Bureau of Investigation's special agents on the scene in 10 minutes to search the man's apartment and then arrest him. So, yeah, like you said, just very credulous calling in that obviously all these spies are everywhere and attempting to buy parts, and you can bring down special agents within minutes.
Now, this gets into, we now come to the part that's sort of, I guess we would call it proto-COINTELPRO, the targeting of the Wobblies. Now, on the show previously, we've talked about targeting of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, in the first Red Scare period after the end of World War I. But we never really talked a whole lot about their targeting of the IWW during the war, and specifically, obviously, the arrest of Eugene V. Debs. So APL agents infiltrated IWW meetings and rallies to write down every speech for possible anti-war content violations and to obtain evidence of IWW promotion of sabotage, at least allegedly. Thomas Russell Gowanlock, yet another young Chicago advertising man, led the Chicago police raids into packed IWW meetings of hundreds, if not thousands, of Wobblies to arrest speakers mid-speech if they said anything that could be considered seditious or treasonous. In cases where they felt they were unable to make a clean arrest, they would call in hundreds of Chicago riot police preemptively to storm the meetings. 165 IWW leaders in Chicago alone were arrested and tried under the Espionage Act, often relying on APL investigations. Volunteer lawyer APL members would then often directly assist the prosecution work during their casework and preparation for trial. The DOJ also was worried about disruption of raw material supply chains in the Mountain West by purported IWW saboteurs or people they thought were potentially IWW saboteurs, and so they often deployed people, not just to disrupt speech, but actually to disrupt economic activities and organizing that we've talked about in their sort of like prairie and mountain mining communities, things like that. The famous arrest and charging of Eugene V. Debs for violations of the Espionage and Sedition Acts was based on a similar infiltration by APL operatives of the Ohio Socialist State Convention in June 16th in Canton, Ohio, which had 261 APL members. The division did. I don't know if they used all of them on that particular operation. Headed by Elton W. Partridge, who was, you guessed it, a newspaper ad executive. And in that particular speech, they managed to get an APL stenographer onto the stage with Debs to be able to take down notes on his entire speech word for word, and then Debs was arrested on that basis on June 30th in Cleveland. So that, I think, as you were saying, Ben, kind of gets into a lot of the post-World War II activities targeting sort of political radicalism within the United States domestically.
Yeah, I think it's a classic. You all did your episode on the 2002 West Coast sort of port lockouts, and there even it was the use of these sort of national security, the specter of national security as a way to crack down on labor organizing. I think it's unsurprising that an intelligence agency founded by and run, at least in name, by these big time capitalists would immediately use that national security pretext as a way to crack down on labor organizing. It's a very, very common approach. The public may not be okay in general with this kind of heavy-handed approach, but you raise the specter of national security, and then immediately the state becomes involved, and then it provides leeway, particularly in a context where you can allege that these organizing workers are going to sabotage our war production, or they're going to impinge on our ability to fight this war. The pretext is so perfect, and it seems almost they almost can't deny themselves. They just have to go in and do it.
Rachel, could you talk about the draft focus of the APL?
Yeah, not only were they interfering in labor matters and in anti-German surveillance, they were also deeply involved in heavy-handed raids and arrests of alleged slackers, which was the World War I term for draft dodgers, or even anyone not carrying their draft cards at all times. Even distribution of anti-conscription literature was illegal. There were an estimated 308,000 draft dodgers during World War I, and typically they were transient working-age men who simply kept moving from town to town to avoid detection or capture. But this made the lodging houses APL targets for door-to-door surprise raids. APL slacker raids ramped up after Bolshevik Russia quit the war, and the manpower needs on the Western Front rose sharply. These raids expanded to unannounced card searches of every man at ballparks, movie theaters, beaches, nightclubs, train stations, etc. Public sentiment was almost uniformly in favor until the New York raids of September 1918 got a bit out of hand, and too many men who weren't carrying cards got caught in dragnets and detained for sometimes days until they could prove their legitimate status and be released. Furious senators and congressmen predictably denounced the heavy-handed slacker raids as being like something from Russia or reminiscent of Prussian militarism, rather than acknowledging it as a homegrown problem. Nevertheless, President Wilson did not publicly oppose the raids, even while expressing private concerns, and the media backed down. Later, the state of Washington conducted an entire statewide raid over a 3-day period. At this point, the war was almost over anyway, it would turn out. Nationally, over the whole conscription period, 20 to 25,000 slackers were caught by the APL. And a side note, they also investigated and apprehended deserters from other Allied armed forces.
Yeah, so no skipping out if you're British, etc. Again, to give you a sense of the scope of this, because, kind of ironically, they're looking at 308,000 draft dodgers or whatever, and by the end of the war, there's almost 300,000 members of the APL. Again, most of them exempt, but some of them could have probably gone and served, if they had really wanted to, if they wanted to volunteer. But those New York raids that ended up being so controversial, those resulted in more than 75,000 arrests, of which only about 400, or maybe not even, were shown to be guilty of anything, and that wasn't just they didn't happen to have their cards on them at the time. As I said, Wilson, kind of one of the through line themes of a lot of this, expressing some private concerns, writing to the Attorney General, it would be dangerous to have such an organization operating in the United States. I wonder if there's any way in which we could stop it, as if this is totally out of the control of the government. But then, when the Attorney General says, oh, these raids are necessary, etc., and, I'm sorry we handled it badly, but, it needed to happen, they just kind of let the matter drop. And then the media was like, oh, well, the president says that, it was necessary, or isn't saying it wasn't a good idea, so I guess we're going to not say anything about it. And we'll get to that in a little bit as well. But there was a pretty significant climate of fear around any sort of expression of dissent or criticism of the presidential administration during this period. So it's not a huge surprise that if he didn't really come out and say, oh, this was bad and shouldn't have happened, that they would kind of back down on their criticisms. Now, APL investigators, again, being flush with cash, unlike the actual government agents, typically, yes, they used low-tech investigative methods like studying public and private records, as we talked about, tailing people, conducting interviews under false pretenses, like that example of updating a city directory or posing as a journalist. But they were also provided with state-of-the-art spy technology for photographing documents or personnel effects during their warrantless searches, or even for recording conversations with dictaphones, which was a new new thing. They were officially advised against wiretapping, but we talked about previously their relationships with, for example, the telephone companies. And one of these relationship effects was that they could feed overheard information from the operators to the DOJ, or even just what we would today refer to as the metadata, right? Who's calling who, where are the phone calls originating from, that sort of thing. There was a similar arrangement for written telegrams. They would get the copies of the telegrams if there was suspicious content, and the post office likewise giving the metadata on, there was a letter sent to this address, and then, this was the return address on it, and then this person came in and sent a letter back, that kind of thing. And they would, cooperate with the APL members if they wanted information on something. Obviously, this ends up being kind of turned toward other things as well.
The APL was also deployed in some cities at night to apprehend bootleggers and other criminal elements, especially if they were linked to military men trying to get booze, etc. And working with the War Department, they monitored military personnel for various criminal activity off base, such as, quote, bribery, theft, embezzlement, and fraudulent requests for furloughs. They also helped the War Department conduct background checks on men applying to be officers or men applying to serve overseas in non-governmental organizations like the Red Cross. And also the APL monitored all manner of fuel, power, and food rationing.
Now, one thing that I don't want to get too far off track on, but is an obvious parallel to the post-World War II state, in the sort of pre-computerization era, government officials would still be relying on these sort of private sector archives to do background checks, right? They just did not have the resources, manpower, paperwork, et cetera, in some cases, especially not at the federal level, like if you're talking about the state governments. And so, this becomes kind of a common feature, much in the same way that, political parties ended up buying advertising market research data from ad companies. Similarly, you would say, oh, who do we know that has a big archive on tons of people across the country and, their purchase histories and things like that. And so you can see kind of the origins of that pattern later emerging as well. One of the APL's more public efforts was soliciting nationwide donations of private photographs or drawings anyone had at home or in newspaper archives of bridges, towns, buildings, localities occupied by German forces in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and future potential occupation targets in Germany. These were requested for Army intelligence and resulted in about 50,000 illustrative materials, often from immigrants from those areas or from American tourists who had visited those cities and towns. But that wasn't the only time that the APL was actually willing to kind of go on the record and not be such a secretive organization.
Yeah, another public APL effort included putting up large posters advertising a tip line for suspected disloyalty after the passage of the Sedition Act. This was relatively unusual for mentioning the American Protective League by name in a public-facing campaign. These ads, they're sort of like the forerunners to the post 9/11 see something, say something posters. At this point, the APL was turning the entire population into full-time snitches who were supposed to report on everyone around them for casual conversational criticisms of the president or praise for Germany. People could be sentenced to a chain gang for toasting the Kaiser, writing a letter to the editor in German opposing Liberty bonds on the basis that they could fund munitions deployed against German civilians if the tide of the war turned, led to a 10-year prison sentence. A German objector urging his friends not to take up arms against their homeland committed suicide after being reprimanded by the APL. A baker was sentenced to 10 years in prison for saying the U.S. shouldn't have entered the war if it needed to raise money to do so, and that U.S. troops would run away from battle anyway.
Now, as Ben said earlier, one of the important things that happens and is a big contributing factor to why there isn't a whole lot of material and familiarity with this organization is what happened after the war. So again, as with many episodes where we talk about World War I, the actual U.S. participation in the war, relatively limited, right? It's April 1917 to November 1918, a very short period of time compared to something like World War II. After the war, there was a raucous debate among the members of the Chicago division of the APL on whether or not to dissolve as instructed or to keep going and pivot explicitly toward anti-socialist activities in Chicago. They ultimately voted to disband, but also voted to destroy all their investigation records rather than turn them over to federal government as they had been ordered to and were expected to do, because they feared retribution from trade unionists if those union leaders ever got their hands on the documents through some kind of public records request. There were 250,000 to 300,000 members nationally at the war's end. The APL conducted over 99,000 investigations on behalf of the DOJ, and they spent about $7,000 a month donated by members and business community supporters. In Chicago alone, the DOJ estimated that 75% of government investigations during the war were conducted by the APL. In the New York City region, it was about half, although they had a much smaller membership count. And again, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, the author of that first book, Mills, argues that one of the reasons that the organization more or less broke up pretty quickly, as expected and ordered by the federal government after the armistice, basically they were gone by February of 1919, so about, 3 or 4 months or so. A lot of these guys had been just doing this as kind of unpaid, hobbyist, patriotic support or whatever, and when you have 300,000 guys who are taking time off from their jobs, or not necessarily that many, because we talked about some of the sort of blue-collar workers that were being assigned these functions by their bosses, a lot of these guys, including some of the key leadership people, really needed to kind of get back to their businesses and support their families and so forth, and couldn't just keep taking off unlimited amounts of time. Obviously, you can guess that there were probably some guys who were pretty gung-ho about continuing and so forth, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about the second book. This is a much more detailed book, a sort of analytical book, written from a very different perspective. This one, I didn't get to all of the chapters on it, but if you can get a copy of it, it's certainly, I think, worth a read. This one's called The Price of Vigilance by Joan M. Jensen, again, published in 1968. That book was written in the context of the upheavals of 1968 and mounting dissent about the Vietnam War. She presents a much more critical view of the APL than Mills and provides far more examples of unseemly behavior and internal scandals, even above and beyond the obvious sort of immoral and unconstitutional suppressions of civil liberties just by the organization basically existing. There's a whole chapter that we won't get into about the clashes between the actual federal and local law enforcement professionals and the APL, because they thought that the APL was basically doing sort of amateur vigilantism in their free time, and they didn't really have a lot of respect for that and felt like it got in the way of their investigations, whereas that Mills book is much more sort of charitable toward this and saying, well, even if these investigations didn't always pan out, it was an important contribution to the war effort, and there were obviously these bad things that happened from it, but it was all undertaken under the best of intentions, etc. Jensen argues that one legacy of the American Protective League's promotion of paranoia and censorship was a huge public backlash after the war ended, when it was finally safe again to criticize the government, the administration, and the war, that it was undertaken under false pretenses to benefit bankers and industrialists, and that backlash did turn into the very deep isolationist sentiments that would later prove so controversial as World War II arrived. And Jensen kind of makes the case that without understanding the level of totalizing illiberalism by the government and these sort of APL henchmen, so to speak, whereas Rachel just gave a bunch of examples where it was literally illegal to criticize the purpose or even the conduct of the war under severe penalty, which they did, mete out to people. A lot of people got commuted sentences eventually, but potentially could have faced very, very long prison sentences if the war had continued a lot longer. There were these spies everywhere, and she makes the case that it's difficult to understand why so many voters and politicians would be so adamantly opposed to U.S. entry into the war again. Because from today's perspective, we think, look at all these isolationist politicians and Americans who, made excuses for Nazi Germany or whatever, and they must have all been Nazi sympathizers. And, this is certainly not a book that would agree with that perspective, but is at least somewhat sympathetic to saying, look, you got to think about the context of this, and that they were reacting to what had happened in World War I and realizing they had been led into war under false pretenses. Could you really trust the government? Was it going to lead to all of these domestic crackdowns and so forth? Obviously, we see things like the Japanese internment end up happening. So certainly some repeats, even worse in some ways, even if it was better in other ways during World War II. And so it's important to kind of take that into consideration. On the other hand, Jensen notes that very little was actually known about the APL during or shortly after World War I because the government refused to declassify files on domestic wartime activities until the 1950s, by which point there was kind of less interest and it had faded from memory somewhat. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting, Ben, was the way that the government handled talking about this organization. J. Edgar Hoover kind of made a huge effort for years to totally distance the Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice from the American Protective League, even though that's obviously a complete lie if you look at any of their cooperation at the time. And like even during the war, they were willing to say like, oh, we've got this, these great patriotic volunteers that are helping us out and so forth. But he kind of like tries to distance himself from that. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, it is interesting because there definitely were people within the U.S. government who sort of recognized they may have thought it was good what was happening, but I think they recognized in a lot of cases that this was going to create a lot of backlash potentially, that people wouldn't be happy with this. But I think that this, the creation of plausible deniability is one of the points of covert operations. It allows you to say, well, this was our agent, and we did not know about these things that this person was doing, despite the fact that we were funding them, that they were briefing us on an ongoing basis, et cetera. That's a very common way that intelligence agencies sort of escape accountability. And it is sort of the basis for how they are able to conduct their activities, that they act via these agents who are not formally a part of the government structures. It's a very, along with destroying records and just being covert in general, it's a very common way that you can take these activities, move them outside of the scope of the public state where they can't be interrogated by the public, where the public has no ability to have a say on what happened or get any kind of accountability, because you can just say, well, it was these agents and maybe they did too much, maybe they were vigilantes, but we didn't really know about it at the time, or all of these other things, which we know are not really true, that we know that they were being briefed on an ongoing basis. So it's a common technique which continues to be used to this day.
Right. Rachel, one of the things that doesn't come up in Mills's much more sort of favorable rendering of this organization goes to that question of the origins of this, the genesis of this organization. What was it about this pitch that resonated when it was presented to them? Because again, it came from the private sector, but for some reason the government was willing to, or at least certain members of the government were willing to entertain this, from the Texan Attorney General on down.
Yeah, this book notes that the Bureau of Investigation superintendent in Chicago, who heard the proposal from A.M. Briggs and obtained the necessary local and federal permissions to approve the league's formation, was Hinton D. Cloubaugh of Alabama. And Jensen argues that he almost certainly endorsed the proposal based on his familiarity with local citizen groups, quote unquote, cooperating closely with law enforcement in the American South. As we know, the Klan was operating in the South for decades.
And was the law enforcement. I mean, this was the new Klan, so to speak, a little bit different from the old Klan. But yeah, these sort of and there was a national kind of crisis and debate at the time around lynch mobs and things like that. So when we're talking about citizen groups, citizen committees cooperating with law enforcement in places like Alabama or places like Texas, that's what we're referring to.
Yeah. And there was already some pre-war work in Chicago around the Bureau of Investigation's federal mandate to stop sex trafficking, where they relied on informants in the hotel industry. The APL would later go on to serve a role in many communities, especially outside of the big cities, that was somewhere between the Pinkertons and the Klan. This was perhaps also true even in the industrial cities as well, once Black workers began flocking to the new defense industry jobs and racial tensions mounted, not to mention APL involvement in unrest between Black soldiers and white civilians.
Yeah, I think you can't really understand the APL without looking at the racial dynamics of this, as well as the sort of labor dispute politics we've already talked about, or the actual directly war-related things. And you can't probably understand how this organization gets off the ground without understanding that this is a local guy from the Bureau of Investigation who's from Alabama, an attorney general who's from Texas, a, militantly white supremacist, pro-segregationist president born in Virginia. That is the context out of which this emerges. The other thing is, Jensen points out that there really was not a lot of backlash to this organization or domestic opposition to it from, there were some people, as we talked about with like the New York raids, who would express sort of public consternation. But in many cases, it wasn't really about the existence of the organization. It was about its methods, what it was being used for, and that sort of thing. The Wilson administration's Democratic bills that we talked about that provided those serious prison times for its critics and opponents of the war did prompt a Republican response. But that Republican response, and we're talking about very high-level people like Henry Cabot Lodge, William Howard Taft, etc., in the party, going out there and publicly calling for widespread civilian use of military tribunals and executions for alleged dissent, or even, calling it treason, sedition, things like that. The general mass hysteria being whipped up and the silencing of dissent left very little domestic political support by 1918 midterms for a moderate peace or any of the future Versailles efforts that Wilson had hoped to promote, contributing greatly to those failures. We talked on a previous episode about the sort of breakdown of that and the, Republican success in the midterms. We also didn't really, talk about, because I don't think we were aware of it. There were people at the time, Democratic machine guys, especially in the North, who were saying, look, these like white collar businessmen, APL guys, are harassing like our loyal, ethnic machine Democrat voters and causing them to vote Republican because they're so frustrated by this, harassment. And sure, probably those businessmen were all Republicans themselves, but this is, an understandable backlash. If you see the Democratic administration hassling you, et cetera, you're going to have that response. Similarly, any sort of like labor people who were sympathetic to the IWW or any of those type of things, or didn't think that their rights should be taken away, they're going to look at that and say, hey, I'm not going to vote for the Democrats in the 1918 midterms. And so this, just sort of rebounds back onto the Wilson administration itself. And, again, it's anything that you do along these lines is going to have these unintended consequences and side effects that, of course, conveniently always seem to benefit the business tycoons. They won no matter what. And as I said before, whenever he was presented with an opportunity publicly to distance himself from the APL or to curb its activities, Wilson seemed to tacitly endorse their actions, although privately he and some cabinet members kept expressing concerns or at least raising questions. We don't have a huge amount of time. We've already gone an hour here, so I will just say that there were some chapters in the book that we're going to skip over about what happened after the League's official dissolution in early 1919. Obviously, suffice it to say, many of the members went back to their lives and businesses, and they were happy to do so. Others remained eager to partner with law enforcement or military intelligence for anti-radicalism after the war, and others, unsurprisingly, filtered over to the resurgent Ku Klux Klan. Ben, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I think just in general that this organization is just very, very fascinating to me, just in terms of how, on the one hand, it is sort of haphazard and almost bumbling in many cases, and on the other hand, it is sort of sweeping. And in terms of the size, I mean, even COINTELPRO didn't have 200, 300,000 agents operating inside the United States. So it's a pretty interesting organization to me. And I think it's emblematic of a lot of the things that later, particularly domestic intelligence operations, would perfect. So I think it's a sort of a fascinating look at the origins of using domestic intelligence agencies for the purposes of suppressing and really managing the internal domestic political situation, both with respect to, as we mentioned, sort of the racial question, as well as the question of workers' rights. So I think this is I honestly, I can't believe I did not know that this organization existed. And there's good reasons for that, as Jensen points out, with many of the documents destroyed, the people not interested in something that was considered old news. But I think it's a worthwhile topic to take a look at and try to understand.
Rachel, I'll go now to you for your closing thoughts. And of course, as I said, there will be additional notes up with the episode because there's more kind of like side tangents that I wrote notes about, but we're not going to get into on the episode. But Rachel, what were your sort of key takeaways or closing thoughts on this?
Well, coming at it from kind of a big picture view, I'm wondering if maybe Jensen was so much more critical of it because she did write it in 1968 when there was a lot of disillusionment with the intelligence community writ large. And then Mills wrote his book in 2013 when like intelligence and surveillance is pretty much just an accepted part of life. So then it is kind of looking at it more from like, oh, the intelligence community is the good guys. And so it's kind of interesting to see how just in these past few decades, our views on both domestic and foreign intelligence has really evolved over the past few decades.
And I know we've got an episode coming up, Rachel, on Frank Church, right? And we're going to be talking about kind of his views on the intelligence community from that sort of earlier perspective.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Well, as I said earlier, our guest today, first time on Arsenal for Democracy. It was great to have him here today. My friend from real life, not just from Twitter, Ben, aka Housetrotter. Thank you so much for being on this week.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was great.
And Rachel, thank you for being on as well.
It was an exciting conversation.